Well, it's very exciting to see all of you, all the names at least that I've seen across the screen. My name's Miriam Goldstein. I teach at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in the Arabic department. I live in Jerusalem. I'm normally, during work hours, found on Mount Scopus, but right now I'm lecturing, of course, from my home. I work on Judeo-Arabic literature. That means what Jews wrote in Arabic, beginning around the 9th century and through the Ottoman period, what could be called early modern or almost till the modern period. My current research is mostly focused on polemic, links between Jews in the Near East and the Mediterranean and Jews in Europe, Jews and Christians. I won't be talking about that tonight, but I'm very open to questions. It's really a pleasure to be with all of you. I'm grateful to the National Library and to Doron for the opportunity to speak in the framework of the reading room. I am grateful to my partner, Misha, for taking the kids for a long park visit so that I could give this lecture from our living room, and for being my AV person to set up our living room to lecture. My talk tonight is focused on Judeo-Arabic literature and culture, from its beginnings and up through the medieval period. What I hope that you come out with today is an understanding of the extent of the Jewish culture that existed in Arabic during what is often called the medieval period, and an understanding, or more, a beginning of an understanding of why this Judeo-Arabic culture and literature is important for understanding the Judaism that you might be familiar with today. As Doron mentioned, there will be Q&A at the end of the lecture, and I'm looking forward to seeing your questions. Before I show any maps or present any of the relevant history, I want to first discuss and show you what is Judeo-Arabic. So what does Judeo-Arabic look like? Judeo-Arabic can look like a letter written from a mother to her son, a manuscript preserved from the Cairo Geniza. Judeo-Arabic can also look like this autograph, meaning handwritten copy, handwritten personal copy, sorry about that, written by Maimonides. Some of you may notice the handwriting or may identify the handwriting. And Judeo-Arabic can also be this work, which is a theological work from the 10th century. You may notice it's written in Arabic characters, not in Hebrew letters. And it was important to me to show you this additional example of Judeo-Arabic. So 3 examples of medieval texts, all of which are defined as Judeo-Arabic. If you look close, by the way, in this Arabic letter manuscript, you can see Hebrew letters or Hebrew words from time to time. The simple definition of Judeo-Arabic is Arabic in Hebrew letters. Now, I know this can cause confusion, so I want to be very clear. My meaning is the language is Arabic, and the characters or the letters are Hebrew. Now, as you see in our 3rd example here, this is not always the case. We do have examples of Jews writing Arabic in Arabic letters, and we may still call it Judeo-Arabic. So it is not just the letters that make a text Judeo-Arabic. It's also the use of Hebrew and Aramaic words, for example, to express religious concepts. A somewhat time-relevant example, a Jew speaking in English might say, today we're going to build our sukkah. They wouldn't say, today we're going to build our booth. Or they might say, she read the Torah wonderfully at her bat mitzvah, not she read the Pentateuch on the day she took upon herself the requirement of fulfilling commandments. So for key terms and concepts, Judeo-Arabic would use Aramaic or Hebrew words. Now, we have other examples in other parts of the world of this type of phenomenon, where Jews adopt a local language, but write in Hebrew letters. I'm sure many of you can come up with examples of this. Probably the most famous is Yiddish. I want to make one important note, that the case of Judeo-Arabic is quite different, I will posit, than any other Jewish language because of the complete immersion of Jews in their environment, culturally, linguistically, intellectually. So envision a Jew in medieval Europe. He or she may write or speak in the local or regional language, even in their home. But in most cases, this Jew is not a participant in surrounding intellectual culture, which would take place in a different language, in Latin. This is not the case for Jews in Arabic-speaking environments in the medieval period. One language was the one spoken at home, the one used in the street, the same one used for scholarship and for scholarly interactions. So there was a nearly seamless transition between Arabic external culture, if we may call it external, and Judeo-Arabic. Now, just a side note, some of you may know that Arabic has different types. There's written or literary Arabic, and there's spoken Arabic. Judeo-Arabic is somewhere on the continuum between the two, depending on who's writing it, when they're writing it. This is something we can talk more about in the question time if you like. Now, what was the significance of this language change? This was an extremely significant change for the Jewish people. That is the adoption of the Arabic language, the history of which I'm about to get to. What was Arabic at the time? And I'll let you know in advance that we're talking about the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries CE, which I'm about to show you in a map. Arabic was the language of intellect, the language of culture, the language of innovation. It was the language which, for the most part, the continuation of the learning of the classical world was continuing. We must also consider the circumstances of adopting Arabic. This meant that Jews were now speaking and using the same language as their neighbors. That is, there were new opportunities for interchange. Scholars of other religions, scholars, Jews, Christians, Muslims, Zoroastrians, Manichaeans, all of the people of the very varied populations that were included in the Arabic-speaking world would be able to interact in a single language. So one of the reasons for the uniqueness of Judeo-Arabic literature was these very opportunities for interchange that are reflected in what and how Jews wrote. The result, which is what we're going to talk much more about today, was vast changes in Jewish scholarship. The Jewish bookshelf before and the Jewish bookshelf after, something I'm actually going to present to you, were two very different entities, or let us say from a certain Jewish bookshelf to a much more expanded Jewish bookshelf. Now, how did this change occur? Why did Arabic become, and when, but right now we're going to talk about the why. Why did Arabic become a central language for the Jews? And just to set it in context, what do I mean by central? For one thing, I mean numbers. In the period that I'm going to talk to you about today, likely some 90% of the Jewish population were native Arabic speakers for a few centuries, definitely between the 9th and the 12th centuries. And the second is the intellectual weight, because this Arabic speaking world would be the center of Jewish intellectual production at this time. So first of all, why Judeo-Arabic? Why did Jews start using Arabic? And on the way, I'm going to talk about the when. Why Judeo-Arabic? So we begin with a map of the late antique world. I'm using the wonderful maps found in Hugh Kennedy's Historical Atlas of Islam. And you see here some of the major empires of the late antique world. You see the Eastern Roman Empire, that is what would in the end be sort of compressed to the Byzantine Empire. You see the Sasanian Empire and other empires further away. These lands would be largely soon to be populated by members of a new religion led by a charismatic leader named Muhammad ibn Abdullah. Many of you, most of you, all of you have heard of this figure. A charismatic leader, a prophet to the new religion. He brought a new religion, a new scripture, and the armies of this religion during the 7th century moved out of what is today's Saudi Arabia through the Near East and the Mediterranean. And that's our next map. Our next map is around the year 750. And you can see outlined in red the outlines of what's called the Umayyad Caliphate or Empire. And in the next map, an even wider range to the east and to the west, what's called the Abbasid Caliphate. These armies, of course, spread a religion called Islam, but of course, Islam leaves room for practitioners of other religions, specifically the religions of the book. So it was not just Islam that was spread, but also a language, the Arabic language. And in slide 10, I'm going to show you the Jewish communities under Muslim rule. This map is not, it can be a little bit difficult to understand, but if you look at the dotted line that goes around, you can see the extent of the rule of the Muslim empire, okay? The major Jewish communities are marked with large black dots. So you can see that if I said that the majority of the Jewish population was in the Near East, it means that 90% of the Jews in the world, by the end of the Islamic conquest, let's say the early to mid 8th century, were now united under one empire, and were also increasingly taking on as a native language the Arabic language. So there was a sort of dual unification for Jewish communities in the map that you see. First of all, the fact that they were all under Muslim rule, and second of all, that they were now all speaking Arabic. And the languages Jews had been speaking before then in the Near East, they had been speaking Aramaic, in some areas Hebrew. In the West, they had probably been speaking local languages. Arabic became the language of the region that was ruled by Islam for the most part. Of course, there are some exceptions to this, Iran being a big exception, Persia. But largely, the religion was spread and the language was spread. The result was a sea change in what Jews wrote. And I mean what in a very, very broad sense of the word what. I mean, not just the language they wrote in, but the subjects and even the genres in which they wrote, and even the style in which they wrote what they wrote. That is, the Jewish bookshelf before this time was a very different entity from the Jewish bookshelf a century or two after the adoption of the Arabic language. So I'm going to show you a snapshot of Jewish literature around 500 CE. I hope I didn't leave anything off. You can feel free to lambast me in the comments if I did, but we have the Bible, Mishnah and the Talmud, written in a combination of Hebrew and Aramaic, the Midrash, also Hebrew with Aramaic, mystical literature, early religious poetry written in Hebrew. For the most part, this was the Jewish bookshelf. Oh, I didn't mention the Dead Sea Scrolls. I mean, all sorts of other things that probably could be mentioned, but I think this gives you a feel for what Jews were writing. In the year 1000 CE, around date, a date which reflects some 200 or more years in which Jews had been fully immersed in the Arabic language, not only for their daily speech, but also, as we will speak about, for their scholarship. What else do we have? We have all of the above, plus line-by-line commentaries on the Bible, theological compendia, so guides to theology, dogma, what a Jew should believe, codes of law, books of commandments, books on specific topics having to do with law, guides to philosophy, grammars of biblical Hebrew, as well as other Semitic languages, comparative Semitics, dictionaries, works on astronomy and other scientific works, and much more, medical works. There was a lot more that I could have put into this slide. All of these new works, 99% of these new works were written in Arabic. I should note that Jews also adopted new ways of writing, new styles in which they would communicate with the audiences who read their works. That is, the two lists that I showed you are different not just in content, but also in the way they were written. So one example is this next slide. This is the first page of a work of Bible commentary. We could talk a lot about the details, but the important, I guess, basic fact to know is that this is a work in Judeo-Arabic. You can see the letters are Hebrew. The language, for those who can read Hebrew letters, is Arabic. The author was a Jewish Karaite living in Baghdad in the 10th century. This is a Bible commentary. How does the concept of authorship change? This, what I have highlighted in red is not a title. It's just an introductory phrase, Bishem Adonai El Olam, almost like the Basmala in Arabic, and there are connections between these two. That's not the title. There's not a title here. There would have been a title page. But you can see that the way this work begins, and those of you who can read Hebrew letters and Arabic will be able to see that the author is completely present in this first line. So I'll just read it and I'll translate it. إني بعد أن فرغت من تأليف هذا الكتاب في معاني التوراة, etc., etc. So when I finished compiling or composing this book regarding the meanings of the words of the Torah, etc., etc. So you can see the author is present in the first sentence. This is not an author who is trying to hide, who is trying to say that some earlier author wrote it. This is not an anonymous work in any sense of the word. This author has declared himself as an author and is explaining the circumstances of his authorship. You can't see this here, but in manuscript after manuscript from this period in Judeo-Arabic, I could show you that works are organized around chapters. This is something we take for granted today, but which was by no means taken for granted in earlier periods of Jewish literature. In Judeo-Arabic composition, this hit Jewish literature for the first time. This was an innovation of the period for Jews and for many others. The adoption of Arabic for writing scholarship ushered in a golden age of creative composition in Judeo-Arabic, about 300 years. The fact that all of these genres began in Arabic meant that they became part of the Jewish library. Now, these are things, if I can go back to what you saw in the previous slide, these are things that we take for granted. Codes of law that are organized by topic and that are written with a table of contents, with chapters, with internal cross-references. And this would be as opposed to the Talmud, also known as the Gemara, which hangs together in a stream of consciousness type of way, a beautiful way, but not the organized way that later works were composed in. Line by line, verse by verse Bible commentaries, not something that is organized in an associative way, like the Midrash. The idea that Judaism has dogma. Authors created lists of beliefs that Jews must possess. The idea of work between Semitic languages, comparative Semitic linguistic work, which I could mention that Jews were very well placed to do, given that they were familiar with at least 2 and sometimes 3 Semitic languages, Arabic, Hebrew, and sometimes Aramaic, and much more. All of these were new and began in Arabic when Jewish scholarship was, by definition, for the most part, carried out in Arabic, and when 90% of the Jewish population expected it to be so. This was their native language. Now, to delve into the specifics of these genres that I have mentioned would take a full-length course, I know, because I teach courses on this topic frequently at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. But for today, I hope I'm giving you a taste of what changed and what was new, and how the Jewish bookshelf that you are familiar with today reflects the innovations of the period in Jewish history that I'm discussing. Now, I want to talk about the bookends of this period, the gradual beginning and the gradual end of this period when Jews carried out daily life as well as scholarship in Arabic. So the beginning we've touched on. It was the transition from the languages that Jews spoke in late antiquity, probably Aramaic, perhaps also Hebrew, to Arabic. And I should mention a large parentheses here, that there were certain communities of Jews who were speaking Arabic even before and using Arabic, even before the Islamic conquest. This is very important to say, in the area of Iraq. But the majority of Jews were likely native Aramaic speakers. There are Jews today who are native Aramaic speakers. At that time, it was a majority language for Jews, and Hebrew. You remember our map, the spread of Islam and Arabic in the 7th and 8th century CE. And then there was a change, because I've mentioned that I'm going to be discussing the period between the 9th and the 12th centuries. around the 12th and 13th centuries, we see a different phenomenon when from Arabic, there occurred a transition back to Hebrew as the language of Jewish scholarship. Okay, so we have the bookends of this period. We begin with a time that I've discussed to some extent, Arabic as the language of Jewish scholarship, a very strong 3 centuries between the 9th and the 12th century, when Arabic could certainly be said to be the major language of Jewish scholarship. And then a period during the 12th and 13th centuries when there is a gradual turn away from Arabic as a language for Jewish scholarly writing. This happened because of various historical reasons that I'm going to discuss, and towards Hebrew as the language that became the great unifier of Jewish communities around the world, as had been the case for Arabic. Now I'm going to do this via two major figures who could be said to be the bookends of this period that I'm discussing. One is the figure known as Saudia Gaon. That'll soon be up on the screen. And the other is the very famous Maimonides. Both figures deserve to be quite famous. You might be more familiar with Maimonides than with Rav Saudia Gaon. By presenting these two figures, I'm hoping to give you a taste of the significance of the linguistic shift to Arabic and what happened to create a later medieval Jewish culture that turned much more fully to Hebrew as the language of scholarship. So the first figure I want to present is the one who was a very important part of the change. And that is Rav Saudia Gaon, Saudia ben Yosef al-Fayumi, a resident of the 9th century. Envision the 9th century before I begin to talk about Saudia. Most Jews in the world speak Arabic as a native language. You believe me about that now, I hope. But scholarship is in a different place. The major scholars of Jewish communities continue to write in Aramaic and in Hebrew for the most part. Languages that many Jews outside the world of the yeshiva or the world of scholarship cannot understand very well. And we know about this from countless historical notes from the period, letters that we see back and forth. The Jews of the 9th century are increasingly less familiar with Hebrew and Aramaic, and they're fluent in Arabic. Now the yeshivot of Babylonia have a tradition. They study the Talmud, the literature around the Talmud. They uphold the scepter of Aramaic and Hebrew. But think about what is going on around this world. An entire world has opened up in Arabic. And the Jews of this world are completely exposed to everything that's going on in Arabic. There are scholars of a wide variety of religions, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, as I mentioned, Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism. It's a very diverse world. Many works from the classical world, works that were transmitted in Greek or in Syriac, are being translated into Arabic. The Jews of the period are exposed to this. Baghdad, for example, is a cosmopolitan place. No one is inside their own religious circle. Everybody has Arabic as a common language. The new world of philosophy, theology, science, it's fascinating, attractive. Who bridges this gap between the traditional Jewish world that is occurring in the yeshiva? And by the way, I don't mean to say that people aren't upholding Jewish traditions and customs and keeping halakha. They are. It's just that there's an entire cosmopolitan world of Arabic that's opened up around them. And what's being written in the Jewish scholarly world is being written in languages that they have less and less access to. Enter Saudia ben Yosef. He's born in Egypt. He travels in the land of Israel, spends time in Tiberias, Tiberia, we know that. He arrives in Baghdad to become a leader there, as I will describe. That's why people call him Saudia Gaon. He becomes the Gaon, one of the leaders of the yeshiva in Baghdad. He's gifted. He has vision, daring. He's also not afraid of conflicts and fights. This is very clear. At age 19, Saudia produces his first work. It's called the Egron, a poet's dictionary of biblical Hebrew. Soon after, he begins work on what would become his most famous, long-lasting, and canonical enterprise, what's called his Tafsir. And there may be many of you who are familiar or who know it from your homes. Tafsir in Arabic means commentary or translation. When I say Tafsir, I mean his translation of the Torah into Arabic. So he begins it very early and works on it for a long time. It really is his magnum opus. This outsider, remember, he's from Egypt, arrives in Baghdad, a real center of intellectual life in Arabic for Jews and for many other religions. He becomes Gaon, head of the traditional scholarly bastion of the yeshiva, which has moved to Baghdad. We're talking about the yeshivot of Sura and Pumbedita, but by then they have moved to Baghdad. He's a visionary. He sets as his goal to ensure that there is no contradiction between these modern fields of study, everything that he knows about philosophy, theology, science, and he knows that his, may I call them his congregation, his community members, the Jews around him, and the Jews throughout the Arabic-speaking world are exposed to. And he wants to ensure that there is no contradiction between these fields of study and between traditional Judaism. So Saudia begins to write. Does he write in Aramaic like the other Gaonim? No, he writes in Arabic. And he is the first from within the traditional establishment to write in Arabic. And he is a trendsetter in this way in the Jewish community of the time. After him, many Gaonim wrote scholarly works in Arabic. Now, he is not the first. Jews before him did write in Arabic and did compose works in Arabic, but he is the first in a position of central authority to do so. From then on, it becomes accepted that Judeo-Arabic is also a Jewish language. It is the default choice for writing. So what I wanted to, this is Saadia's location, Baghdad. There, that's where he was. And I wanted to show you the oldest manuscript of Saadia's Tafsir, which is preserved in St. Petersburg, Russia. You can guess which verses are here. I put verses of the beginning of the Torah because soon the Torah reading will start again, afresh, in a week or so. You can see that this manuscript is beautiful. You don't need to even know how to read Hebrew characters to be able to see that it's written in a beautiful Hebrew script. The bigger letters are the biblical verse, and then there's a square Hebrew script that's used for Judeo-Arabic. So this is just an example of what Saadia did in order to accommodate the changes that had occurred around the Jewish community, the adoption of Arabic, and his trying to update what was going on in Jewish scholarship and being willing to produce a written, authoritative translation of the Torah, and by the way, other books as well. He didn't translate the whole Bible, but he translated the Torah, the full Torah, 5 books of Moses, and a number of other books, oftentimes important liturgical books. And he, in this way, updated the Jewish bookshelf and made Arabic a language that was acceptable for Jewish scholarship. So Saadia was an incredibly significant figure in this change to Arabic. Yes, the Islamic conquest and the growing Islamic empire was the reason that Arabic came to the region. It was the reason that generations of Jews became native Arabic speakers. That's true. This was just history. This was just fate, if you will. But Saadia, in the 9th century, was the figure who made Arabic an acceptable language for Jewish scholarship. And people took this up and ran with it. So from the 9th century, when Saadia began to write, till the 12th century, as I said, nearly every work of scholarship, and I realize that there are growing centers in Europe, which I'm going to talk about, but major works of scholarship were written in Judeo-Arabic. The next figure I want to present is the other end of this period, Moses Maimonides, Moshe ben Maimon, Musa bin Maimun, also known as the Rambam. Maimonides was born in Cordoba in the 12th century, in the early 12th century. So you can see it here. This is a wonderful map, by the way, of Spain. You'll see that the names of the cities are written in Arabic, as they were known for many years. Maimonides was born in Cordoba in the early 12th century, and he died in Egypt in the year 1204. Now, I want to preface and say that many details about Maimonides' biography are unclear. You can pick up any one of a number of works in English about him and see different opinions and different conclusions from the somewhat spotty facts we have. What is clear is that he was born in the brilliant society that was Andalusia, Al-Andalus, a world that was, like the East of Rav Saadia Gaon, wonderfully varied, linguistically, religiously, scholastically. Maimonides wrote a wide variety of works, the majority of them in Judeo-Arabic. Here, I don't want to focus on his works though. I want to focus on personal observations that he made in his letters, which are preserved both in Hebrew and in Judeo-Arabic. Now, Maimonides wrote his letters in both languages, depending on the person he was writing to or the community he was writing to. His letters were considered valuable enough that even during his lifetime, they were already being copied and preserved in collections. Now, to preface, I said that he mostly wrote in Arabic, but he wrote his work known as the Mishneh Torah, a legal code, which was canonical both then in his lifetime and now, in Hebrew. He wrote it in Mishnaic Hebrew, in a beautiful Hebrew style, and consider that his native language was assuredly Arabic, a Maghrebi, a North African or Andalusian kind of Arabic, not Hebrew. Maimonides received a request from a Jew from Baghdad named Yosef ibn Jabir, who appreciated Maimonides' works in Judeo-Arabic very much. And he wrote him about his Mishneh Torah, which was written in Hebrew. And he wrote him asking Maimonides to have the Mishneh Torah, this legal code, translated into Arabic. Now, I'm going to show you the text, and note that the Hebrew I'm going to show you is a translation from Arabic. This letter survived both in Hebrew translation and in the Arabic original, but the Arabic original doesn't contain the line that I want to show you. I do believe that that line was in the original. So I'll read it. You understand the request. This Baghdadi Jew, I'm gonna go back up here. This Baghdadi Jew, he's not amazing in Hebrew. You know, picking up a book in Hebrew and reading it cover to cover is not exactly his thing. He likes to learn though, and he wants to be able to read the Mishneh Torah, which is quite a long work, many volumes, easily. So Maimonides writes him back, and he says, and it's my English translation, "And I tell you, do not minimize your capabilities and do not lose hope. Many of our great sages began studying at a late age and achieved great things. And you too should try to learn the Hebrew that I used in composing this work, for it is easy to understand and not at all difficult to learn." So Maimonides is saying, I didn't use the most difficult Hebrew. I used a Hebrew, and Maimonides actually says this about Mishnaic Hebrew, that he believed that it was the clearest and most plain of Hebrews, and that was why he chose it. He didn't choose to write in biblical Hebrew. He probably could have. And he continues, "After you practice it in one section, meaning in one section, I think of his Mishneh Torah, you will understand the composition as a whole." And then he responds to the specific request. He says, and I've tried to convey sort of the tone of his Arabic, "I refuse to even consider translating it, meaning the Mishneh Torah, into the Arabic language, for its grace would be lost. Indeed, I am hoping to restore the commentary on the Mishnah, what is called Perush HaMishnayot, it was written in Arabic, and the Book of Commandments, his Sefer Mitzvot, to the Holy Tongue." So meaning, he says to his interlocutor, I can't translate my Arabic works into Hebrew. Even my I can't translate my Hebrew works into Arabic. Even my Arabic works which were written in Arabic, I am planning on translating them into Hebrew. He did not do this, by the way. And he continues that I should translate this composition, the Mishneh Torah, into the Arabic language. Request this not. Now understand, this is not because Maimonides did not like the Arabic language. Many Jews of Maimonides' time, before Maimonides' time, actually decry the fact that the Hebrew language is not broad enough to suit what they want to write, that for philosophical terms, for scientific terms, they need to use Arabic. They can't use Hebrew. Maimonides is saying something different here. Maimonides is speaking from his heart. He's talking about his belief that he should have been writing in Hebrew. Now, why should he have been writing in Hebrew if the Arabic language, pretty much until his time, was considered definitely up to the task? Arabic was the language of scholarship. Translators who needed to translate from Arabic into Hebrew bemoan the fact that they don't have all the words they need, that Hebrew didn't have as many words as Arabic. So why does he say this? He's saying this because of a historical change in the Jewish community. He has a strong sense that the scepter of Jewish scholarship, that if you will, the center of gravity of Jewish scholarship has moved. The center of gravity of Jewish scholarship in Maimonides' time, or towards the end of his life, and he's writing from Egypt, he feels that it is less and less in the East, and that it is more and more in the communities of the Northern Mediterranean, in the communities of Europe. That's what he's talking about. He loves the Arabic language. Maimonides, his Arabic is beautiful. Arabic is a wonderful tool for him. At this point, he understands that the tides have changed, and that if he wants to reach large communities of Jews and all of the communities of Jews, he needs to be writing in Hebrew. And I want to show you one more letter. Maimonides, this was not the only request that Maimonides got to translate his works. Maimonides was in close contact, even though he was in Egypt, like many Jews, he was in close contact with Jews around the Mediterranean, and he was in close contact with the Jews of Provence, of southern France. And Maimonides received a request towards the end of his life, a request from the community of Lunel in southern France to translate one of his great works, the Guide to the Perplexed, Dalalat al-Ha'irin, or Moreh HaNevuchim, into Hebrew. He had written the work in Arabic. It was a philosophical work. He was used to reading philosophy in Arabic, and he wrote his work of philosophy in Arabic. He got a request from this community of probably French-speaking Jews, but Jews who were used to reading scholarly works in Hebrew. He got a request to translate it into Hebrew. Let us look at Maimonides' response to this community of Lunel. So he wrote to them in Hebrew, of course. They were Hebrew readers. And so you have the Hebrew here for anybody who wants to go back in the recording. And I'm going to read from the English, my English translation. And by the way, I'm using the edition of the Rav Shelat from the Yeshiva of Ma'ale Adumim, a wonderful edition of Maimonides' letters with Hebrew and facing Judeo-Arabic when the original is in Judeo-Arabic. And what you requested, that I would translate it, the Guide to the Perplexed, for you into the Holy Tongue, would I had the days of old to carry out this request for this book and for the other books that I have composed in the moribund language of Kedar, for I have dwelled in their tents. Now, when he says the language of Kedar, he's using a biblical metaphor to talk about Arabic. And when I use the word moribund, I certainly do not mean anything negative. Maimonides uses the word Kedar asher hikdir shimsha. Okay, but the point is, his point is that the language is no longer universally relevant for Jews. So that's why he calls it moribund. Certainly not dying out. Many Jews continue to have it as their native language. He's surrounded by them in Egypt. But he believes that that sun has set. And that's exactly the metaphor he uses in his letter. He continues. And I would gain great pleasure from this, to sift the wheat from the chaff and to return the lost item to its owners. So these are the metaphors he uses for translating his Guide to the Perplexed into Hebrew. He calls it returning the lost item to its owners. So there was a real, oftentimes when Jews speak about language at this time, and those of you who are familiar with the literature of Iberia will be very familiar, there are nationalistic motifs, language related to religion. He continues, but my circumstances being what they are, and even the earlier works I've written, and others that I composed in the language of the sages, but which are not fully clarified, I have no time to polish them for distribution, much less to translate them into a different language. That is, Maimonides is making the point that, first of all, he is completely in favor of translating his Arabic works into Hebrew. Compare this response to his response to the enthusiastic learner who wrote him from Baghdad. The learner from Baghdad, he tells him, learn Hebrew. This community, he tells them, you know what? I believe that this is necessary. I believe that I should do this. He later in the letter, what he explains is that he doesn't have time, but that there's a translator. The members of the Ibn Tibon family were his translators. Shmuel Ibn Tibon is the translator, and he writes back and forth with him. We have wonderful records of this correspondence. He clearly has a strong sense that the communities of southern France, one should also note Iberia, we should not forget the northern France of Rashi, but they're not in connection with Maimonides. He realizes that these communities are the heirs of the learning tradition that had until then been centered in the East. From around this point on, Hebrew took the lead. Arabic had been the language of communication between most Jewish communities for the past few centuries and the shared scholarly language, but the end of Maimonides' life signals a change. In Europe, the communities we have been discussing clearly used Hebrew. Arabic was not an option for them. We have other correspondences between them and scholars in the Judeo-Arabic world who say, hey, we heard that you had this great work of such and such in Arabic. Could you translate it for us? There was a back and forth of translation growing during the 12th, 13th centuries. In the East, in Arabic-speaking areas, even though Arabic was their native language, they increasingly, in the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, chose to write scholarly works in Hebrew. Now, we have to turn to Jewish history as well to understand this change. This was a fact that was encouraged and buoyed up by the arrival of refugees from Iberia during these centuries, scholars who were accustomed to writing in Hebrew. From this point on, if works that had been composed in Judeo-Arabic, this plethora of works, which by the way, many of them are studied by me and other scholars of Judeo-Arabic, and there's a lot more to figure out. If these works were not translated into Hebrew during this period of transition, 12th, 13th, 14th century, their chance of continued transmission and survival was low. So I'm generalizing and speaking broadly, of course. Of course, there were pockets of survival of great collections of Judeo-Arabic, such as the Yemenite community. But overall, what I've said is true. If you wanted to pass the border of the 12th, 13th, 14th century and the increasing change and writing in Hebrew, you needed to be translated if you were written in Judeo-Arabic. The works of Saudia Gaon are an example. A real Gaon, as we could say, a genius of Jewish literature, a genius for what he accomplished in the 9th century and deciding that works needed to be written in Judeo-Arabic. And many scholars, like myself, are now trying to piece his works together from bits and fragments of manuscripts in manuscript collections known as Genizot. So again, there are exceptions. There were certain communities, that did preserve Judeo-Arabic, but for the most part, what became canonical, what made it to the Jewish bookshelf in the later medieval period was in Hebrew. The central points that I mentioned earlier as parts of Judeo-Arabic literature, the genres they chose to write in, the structure of their compositions, the fact that you would begin with an introduction, that you would organize your work in chapters, the writing style, the turn to the reader, hoi, oh reader, listen, reader, all of these that those of you who are familiar with medieval composition in Hebrew are familiar with, these remain. But the actual works in Judeo-Arabic are in many cases like icebergs under the ocean. Vast, basic, in that they provided a base, but you can't see them. The visible part of Jewish scholarship is, for the most part, written in Hebrew in the later medieval period, and the vast and formative literature in Judeo-Arabic that preceded them either is, in the best case, preserved only in manuscript. This is the work for me and my colleagues, or in the worst case, lost in the original, and hopefully it was translated. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to listen to questions now.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Goldstein. There is a request by someone who would like your email. I don't know if you want to post it, or they can write me with pleasure and I can forward your email to them if you would like.
Okay.
That said, there are a lot of compliments in the chat. My favorite is Gabrielle wrote, "This is really fascinating and stimulating. I am really enjoying it. Really great insight and education for me. Thank you very much." Now for questions. I'll send you the chat transcript because there are many, many compliments. Robbie asked, he said that you stated that in regions that were that Muslims ruled, the people spoke Arabic. Is this true in Palestine?
That's a great question. I'm really glad that you brought that up. So the situation of, first of all, maybe I'll go back to my map so that you can see that the conquest certainly included Palestine, or the land of Israel. I'm going to go back. I'm going to go back to the map of the Umayyad period. No, we'll go back to the Abbasid period. So you can see, I mean, it's a great question because the land of Israel is exactly in the center of this Islamic ruled Arabic speaking empire that we're talking about. Now, what this allows me to mention is that obviously these armies of groups of Muslims who were very small groups in the beginning. I mean, Muhammad was an incredibly charismatic and convincing leader to gather people around him and to get them to move out west into North Africa, east into areas that were ruled by powerful empires. I mean, the Byzantines and the Sasanians had been warring against each other very effectively during the previous century. But we must remember, and Robbie's question really brings this out, that there were native populations, and the native populations were speaking other languages. I said that in the area of Iraq, for example, let's say the area between the two rivers, between the Euphrates and the Tigris, there were native Arabic speakers before Islam was even born. But in many areas, and for example, in the land of Israel, or the region, let's say it's called the Levant, I mean, I can even include today's Lebanon, Syria, large groups of Jews and Christians. And I should note that these areas achieved Muslim majorities at very differing times. The area of the Arabian Peninsula, today's Saudi Arabia, became Muslim very quickly. For the area of the land of Israel to become fully Muslim, or not fully Muslim, because there were always communities of Jews and Christians, but majority Muslim, took till past the 10th century. The linguistic change probably occurred relatively quickly. And I think that we could confidently state that within about a century, the inhabitants of almost all of the regions of the Muslim ruled areas, except for Iran preserved, or Persia preserved Persian, and I expect the Jews did too, had become native Arabic speakers. Now, let's not forget Aramaic. Aramaic was the lingua franca of much of the eastern regions at the time of the Islamic conquest. And it was preserved in pockets, oftentimes because of geographical specifics. You know, somebody lives way up high on a mountain, or it's separated from everybody else via rivers and a lake. Well, guess what? They continued speaking Aramaic even until the present day. I mean, Aramaic is a fascinating linguistic case because of that. But I think that we could probably say that Arabic was spoken as a majority language in the area of the land of Israel or Palestine till by, you know, about a century after the Islamic conquest. And I just conclude with the fact that one indicator of this is the very large and influential Karaite community that lived in the land of Israel. They had almost a Zionist belief in the idea that they needed to return to Zion. And from their beginnings, somewhere in the areas of Persia, a community had developed around the early 10th century, around the year 900. And they wrote in a beautiful Judeo-Arabic. So Arabic was clearly, you know, the language that they were using, and I assume most people around them.
Thank you very much.
What next?
First of all, I have to apologize for all the questions that I'm not asking, as we are kind of running out of time, but I'm trying to focus on a few other questions. I have about 2 or 3 more. So Joe asked, what was the advantage or significance of writing Arabic and Hebrew? Why not simply write Arabic and Arabic if the large majority of Jews were fluent in Arabic?
Joe, thank you for that question. That is, I could have said that I wanted to plant that question. I didn't plant any questions. Joe, that was great. This is a very important question. The significance of, so first of all, let's remember that reading and writing are very different skills in the medieval world. So let's say your average Jewish child, probably a male, who was lucky enough to go to school and to learn to read, he would have first learned Hebrew characters. So one is a reason of practicality, that most Jews were first exposed to Hebrew letters. If you were a budding scholar, or let's say you wanted to have access to the wealth of scholarship that I've mentioned, then you would learn also, you would make it your business to learn Arabic characters. Writing was a very different skill. To learn writing, writing was not like today, you pick up a pen. Writing meant you had to have access to ink. You maybe had to create your own ink. You had to create your own quill. And it was concomitantly difficult physically to write. If you've ever tried to write with a quill and ink, it's not an easy task. So chances are that a Jew who had learned to write would write in the characters that he was most familiar with, and the ones he had learned first. The other thing, though, that it's important to say is that there was definitely a concept in the world that I'm describing, in the late antique or in the Islamic world, of a religion and a script going together. So that it's not just a question of practicality. There certainly was also an element of the heart or of the faith here. But I still think that 90%, what we're talking about, or 99 even, is the idea of practicality. And I'll just conclude with the fact that it's, the reason this topic is so fascinating is that preserved in letters from manuscript collections, we can see that sometimes, for example, a Jew from Egypt might write to a scholar living in Jerusalem and say, he's writing in Arabic, I want you to write to, create for me this concise Bible commentary. People had requests like that. Because your Bible commentary is so long, please can you make a concise version for me? This would, of course, have been accompanied by a donation. And then the scholar in Jerusalem writes back, okay, I can do that. Would you like it in Hebrew script or in Arabic script? So it's clear, obviously, that the language would be Arabic, but the option does exist for requesting a different script. So there are certainly some Jews who were more comfortable in reading Arabic script. That's true. But I would say for the most part, because of the methods of education in those times, Hebrew script for reading, and for those who could write, Hebrew script for writing would have simply been the most convenient.
Thank you so much. Renee asked, are there documents online in the National Library website? So I want to answer that. Of course there are, and you are very welcome to look us up on online. If you ever reach the National Library of Israel, you can see many, many, many digitized documents in very high quality, and many of them are also available just online if you're not in the library. There's one more question that I'm going to read out. Again, I'm sorry for all those who I'm skipping over. Eliyahu asked, is there any hope of discovering documents from Babylon around the time of Saudia? And before you answer that, I'm sorry, there's just one more question I would like to answer. A lot of people are asking if this event is being recorded. So yes, it is, and I will post the link once more in the chat room. Thank you, Dr. Goldstein.
Is there hope? Look, I mean, one thing that I didn't mention, and I am glad for the opportunity to mention it. I'm going to share my screen with you one more time. I didn't talk about how we know all this. Sorry. How do we know all of this? How do I know all the things that many of the topics that I mentioned? So it wouldn't be correct not to mention to you my sources. So there are two major, and I will get to your question, Eliyahu. There are two major manuscript sources that serve researchers and teachers like myself. We are lucky to have digitized images of many of these, thanks to the National Library of Israel, and also the Friedberg Jewish Manuscripts Library, which you can also find online. Two wonderful resources for anyone interested in manuscripts in Hebrew script. But the reason that I can tell you the things that I told you today are largely due to two large manuscript troves. One of them, this title is in Hebrew, I apologize. It wasn't planned for the lecture, but the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Cairo. This is a synagogue that preserved over 200,000 fragments in its Geniza. It's Geniza, the place where Jews would, or congregants of this synagogue would put worn out holy books or anything they thought was holy. They had an interesting way of deciding what they would put in. They put in almost anything that was in Hebrew script. So we have this is a trove of manuscripts and fragments relating not just to religious topics, but also to daily life. Letters, the letter I showed you from a mother to a son in the beginning of my presentation was from the Cairo Geniza. The Jews, the Rabbinite Jews of Cairo would throw their worn out manuscripts here because of the dry climate in Egypt. They were well preserved until the 19th century when they began sort of cropping up in markets. And then when the scholar of Jewish literature, Solomon Schechter from England in the late 19th century came and sort of collected all of them and then staged this picture. And admittedly, most pictures in the late 19th century were staged, so it wasn't just him staging things. But that's what's called the Cairo Geniza. And then I'll just mention another collection. This is an image of a Karaite Jew from the Crimea named Abraham Fierkovich, who also collected from Genizot and from Jewish communities around the Middle East in the 19th century. Also in the 19th century, it was a time when many collectors were trying to enrich manuscript collections. So Abraham Fierkovich traveled in some very daring, by the way, he traveled when he was about that age. He was an older man, shall we say, when he traveled, and he left a diary in Hebrew of his travels. So we have a lot of information about his collections, but this is preserved in the Fierkovich Collection of the National Library of Russia in St. Petersburg. And some of the manuscripts I showed you in our presentation today were from the Fierkovich Collection. So these are two very large manuscript collections that were saved due to the tenacity of two 19th century scholars, Solomon Schechter and the Karaite Abraham Fierkovich of the Crimea, and also thanks to climatic conditions. So, and there's also, I mean, there are new discoveries all the time. There's the Afghani Geniza that Eliyahu's question raises and that you can read a lot about, where its treasures are far from fully revealed. But if you Google the Afghani Geniza, you'll see that we've learned a lot from that. It's not as large, not at all as large as the Genizot I was talking about. But who knows? But I mean, we had luck with these manuscripts that were preserved in Cairo and other Middle Eastern communities. And maybe we'll have more luck sometime. We can hope.
Thank you so much, Dr. Goldstein. I will open everyone's microphone so you can personally say thank you to Dr. Goldstein. I will send you the chat because there's so many compliments and thanks in the chat, Dr. Goldstein, so it would be nice.
Thanks to all of you. It was really a pleasure.
Thank you all, and we'll see you in the next event.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a fascinating lecture.
Thank you, Miriam. Thank you very much, and have a good year.
Thank you, Miriam.
Can you send out your
Thank you, Miriam.
Thank you. That was wonderful.
Here, I'll write my address.
Please.
Miriam, Shana Tova.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you from Italy.
Oh,
Shana Tova. Say hello to mother.
Thank you, Shana Tova.
thank you so much to all of you.
Say hello to the kids.
That's interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you from Canada.
Wow, thank you.
Uncle Harold.
Hi, Uncle Harold.
Thank you from Buffalo, New York.
Oh, wow.
Thank you from Toronto, Canada.
Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you from Los Angeles.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yay.
Thank you from Stockholm.
Brookline, Massachusetts.
oh, Brooklyn.
Oh,
A favorite.
Thanks from Karsava too.
Yay.
Thank
Nice
you.
having you.
Thanks from Amsterdam.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you from Beit Shemesh.
Wow, thank you.
Miriam, thank you very
Really
much.
nice
Shana
to meet
Tova.
you.
Fatima Tova.
Shana Tova, Fatima Tova.
Thank you. Thank you from Stockholm.
Wow, Stockholm.
Thank you from
Philadelphia.
Oh, Philadelphia.
And Los Angeles, of course.
LA.
Thank you
I
from
am-
Armagh, Florida.
Chrissy, Tampa, Florida. Hi, Carol. Oh.
I'm an Iraqi Jew. I'm an Iraqi Jew, and I can read these letters. It's just like
Wonderful.
Yiddish. They started with Hebrew, and they continue with Hebrew. Some people didn't write at all in Arabic. The
Right.
only language, the only scripture it was in Hebrew, and they wrote Arabic in Hebrew. Very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you all. See you in our next event. Chag Sukkot Sameach. Happy New Year.
Thanks to all of
Masalami.
you. Salami.